Welcome to our second to last FishSounds Educate Seminar. Today we'll be hearing from Dr. Isla Davidson from Cornell University about global bioacoustics collaborations and her work with WOPAM Day. Before we get started, please note that this seminar is being recorded to be put on the FishSounds YouTube channel and that there should hopefully be time for questions at the end. So with that, please take it away, Isla.
Thanks, Audrey, and thanks everyone for taking some time in your day to be here with us virtually, and also for those who are across on YouTube. So I'm going to quickly try and share my screen with you. Hopefully this will work. Let me know when that is all nice and visible.
Looks beautiful.
Great. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the World Oceans Passive Acoustic Monitoring Project. And this is one of those options of a global collaboration in exploring bioacoustics and underwater sounds. So to start with, what I really want to actually highlight is that we're already currently in a sort of collaborative community through FishSounds. And for those of you who haven't had a chance, there are these fantastic talks that have come before me. And I just want to highlight that Kieran's spoken, Fani, Ashley, Jack, and Aaron, and we have our very own Audrey talking as well coming up. And so it's just to showcase that there is such a variety of research and learning actually happening within the bioacoustics space in terms of using sound and how we can better understand that. And that is part of how you bring in a variety of expertise into any collaborative effort around the world. And so I really hope that this space can be something where any of you can come in and interrupt and share ideas, or even if you're on YouTube, then comment and be part of the conversation, because that's really what part of this community is about. And so first I was thinking about how would we explore the need for a collaboration. So when any collaboration that you have, what really is that collective shared goal that brings you all together? And for us, at least within the WOPAM project, I'll go into more detail later on, but really when I was thinking about what brings us together, there's first this real desire to use what we hear and what we learn by listening under the water to really explore and discover and have and gain this better understanding of these environments, whether that's particular species or habitats that we're interested in. And as you sort of advance your understanding, not only through science, you're really starting to encourage and celebrate what you're learning. So this is a space where you can increase participation, motivation that can lead to positive action. Just for example, knowing why a particular fish might be whooping, or that there are some of the really loudest creatures underwater are these small crustaceans snapping away. Or that you have whales that are communicating with these sort of top of the pops songs that really are the coolest thing in their group, and then slowly it doesn't become the sort of popular song and something else catches on, and that's across whole oceans. These are really fascinating things, and I think kind of worth celebrating, and how we explore more between this partnership of discovery and understanding and that motivation towards action. And so thinking a little bit, bear with me on this, but if we're thinking a bit about, okay, what are the sort of elements that come into any collaboration, not only a bioacoustics collaboration, but just any one. It's really how we craft that collaborative effort from the varied participants. So we've got, about a bunch of us here right now, and if you sort of think about, okay, what are our capacities within the group? And if I just pick a random option of how good are we at baking cupcakes? The majority of us will fall in that arid average, which is that yellow zone in that distribution of the bell curve, which is we're all pretty good, or the most of us get by on making a relatively decent cupcake. Some of us here will be actually exceptionally good, and so we're in that right hand side orange part of the curve of that. There aren't that many who are as good as us at making cupcakes. And on the other hand, there'll be some of us, definitely me, who's on the lower end of the side, who's just, unfortunately, try as I might, it's not in my skill set to make excellent cupcakes. And so the point of this is that when you're looking at the individual level of how we engage with what we're learning or how we move forward things that we care about, we're bringing in our own capacities, our tendencies, and our own skill sets to that. And if you expand that across, so we take that same cupcake perspective and we think about that and we take it to community levels, suddenly it's really all over the place. And that's because if you go to a different part of the world, they don't make cupcakes. Cupcakes aren't really part of a cultural norm. Maybe they eat savory food, or maybe you're part of a social group that's vegan. And so what you qualify as a really tasty cupcake is based on totally different ingredients. And so you start to see how the context that we occupy, be that our historical, ecological, social context, is going to influence some of the ways we explore what we know and the ways that we move our work forward. And so when you're taking this perspective of the individual and our capacities within that, all the way into our social space and how we actually develop our expertise and what we care about, that's what feeds into this idea of multidisciplinary action. And so you'll see, I put multidisciplinary in brackets because it's such a commonly used term, but I think it's really important to break down what does that mean? Because when we're talking about a multidisciplinary collaboration and we're bringing in different people, that's really incorporating from the individual all the way up to their culture and their norms, and then into the disciplines and their expertise that they bring in. And so it's not only what we're listening to, but it's very much how we listen. And this needs to be really carefully thought about in any collaborative effort if you really want all of those voices to come together and bring in thoughtful action as well as thoughtful communication. So you have clarity of your shared goals within your community, and then how you work out with that towards people who've never heard of your collaborative effort, that needs to be really clearly thought about. And so this ties into how we communicate what we're doing. And so that is not only about how we engage with the work that we're doing, trying to achieve those shared goals, but it's really about carefully thinking about how we communicate that. And so I just wanted to highlight this as the fact that UNICEF has this fantastic explanation of this in more detail, if you'd like to know more. But I was thinking about how do we communicate in a way that actually motivates action towards our shared goals? You know, how are we trying to create change with these collaborations? And a big part of that is thinking about the social and behavior change communication. So there's so much going into how any individual connects with the work, but also how we communicate to have impact. And so it's important to think about in this collaborative effort that we're all influenced by our own psychology. So this might be things like our own opinions on certain behaviors or what we think we might be capable of doing as individuals. It might also be your social space. So this will be strongly influenced by the groups that you occupy and what people feel and think within those spaces, as well as the community dynamic. How much do we think we can do as a group to try and motivate this positive change? As well as the environment. And when you're thinking about global collaborations, you really have to take into account the fact that all over the world, our environments are going to be hugely different. And so the communication environment, what information we're actually exposed to, what we're learning, also what alternatives feel like they're available for us, as well as just the institutions and the infrastructure that supports us to actually have that action and be able to move forward. And so I just want to highlight that these are some of those core principles in any collaboration, let alone one that then is on a global scale, that you really need to carefully think about if you want to tailor it towards trying to create some action towards your shared goals. And so now I thought we could just dive into the WOPAM project itself and what it is and where it comes from, and let you know a little bit about how we're trying to work as a global collaboration towards our shared goals through the use of sound underwater. And so to start with, we actually start with a different collaboration, which was that they were thinking about this huge mix of different institutions and people working all over the world. We're really identifying that there is this need to have a sort of access and understanding to a global library of these biological sounds that are happening around the waterways all over the world, and really try to have a shared space where we can advance that learning together. And from within this, there were a handful of people who were thinking, okay, how could we work around that? And so we had Dr. Miles Parsons from Australia, Steve Simpson from the UK, and Aaron Rice at the Lab of Conservation Bioacoustics, where I'm based. And they were thinking, okay, well, how could we do this, motivate some action And with some funding from the Richard Lounsbury Foundation, as well as support from the International Quiet Ocean Experiment and the scientific community for oceanic research, they were like, okay, well, let's create the World Oceans Passive Acoustic Monitoring Project. And that is really exploring a day in the life of our world's underwater soundscapes. So what that is to record and document, recognize and analyze, understand and celebrate these underwater sounds that we're hearing, and having this real unified recording effort that is focused on the United Nations World Oceans Day. Now, sorry, I think the video might be a little jumpy on Zoom, forgive me if it is. But just to say that this was really a way of, okay, on the United Nations Day where they focus in on the oceans, what about if we focus in on listening all around the world? And so from that came our shared mission, which was to really foster a global interdisciplinary community that's really engaged in recording, analyzing, and utilizing these underwater sounds. And by sort of diving into this global acoustic perspective, we wanted to bolster scientific research, really encourage a deeper affinity with marine environments, as well as supporting ongoing conservation action. And when we think about going back to that idea of shared goals, this really is our collaborative shared goal. And so this breaks down into sort of three main objectives. So the first one was to advance bioacoustics research. How can we use the WOPAM effort to really support that? The second was to engage and celebrate with what we're hearing. You know, what does it really mean to be delving into these underwater environments and listening in? And to really encourage that this is a space where anyone can participate. You don't have to be an expert bioacoustician to be a meaningful contributor and celebrator of what we're learning. And finally, we're seeing how can we make this WOPAM effort useful for conservation action. There's absolutely amazing work happening all over the world. How can we try and support that? And so what happened is we started in 2023 and we recorded with 120 collaborators around the world that were recording at about 300 different global locations. And in 2024, we had 180 collaborators that came together and recorded at 400 global locations, which is really quite exciting, I think. And one thing just to highlight that we can think about a little bit is when we are recording around the world and trying to tell the story of a global perspective, it is really important to think about where have we actually listened to. And so this is just an example of an incredible effort with participatory science where people contributed their recordings of birdsong and around the world. So what you see, the glowing light, that's how much data was contributed in these areas. So it's absolutely amazing in terms of a collaborative effort on a terrestrial side. But when you, a little bit of a jump there. But when you compare that to when you see this peak vertebrate diversity on land, you can see that some of the areas that are perhaps not as heavily sampled are still really big hubs of biodiversity. And so it's important to be careful when we consider where we're sampling versus also how much is there. And this is also not only a terrestrial situation, this is of course very relevant within the ocean environments. And so this paper by Tittensaw is just to highlight that across the different taxonomic groups that we see, you find that the diversity and that clustering of high numbers of species, that's going to differ across the oceans. And so we really want to be mindful when we're talking about a global perspective that we are also sampling around the world in a way that actually represents all of these different areas equally, or as equally as possible at least. And so another way to highlight this is just a really cool paper that was done by Kevin Darrison and his co-authors, where that line that you see dotted down the middle is the equator. And as you move further north or south from the equator, you can see that you have the height and the depth of the oceans. And they are showing all these different soundscape entries from around the world and their different heights and depths, which is really cool. And what we can see is there's this real hub of recordings happening in this particular latitude there. And when you scale that to the sort of global map, we can see that this is associated very strongly with Europe and with North America. Now that's still absolutely amazing effort, but it's just important to be mindful of that where is within our global collaboration, where is the data representing the work that's being done, and how can we try and make sure that that is really carefully encompassed in that story. And so what I'm going to talk about now is some of the needs that we have within the bioacoustics community that WOPAM is trying to help towards and contribute to. And so one of the main ones is really uncovering the unknowns. The ocean environments are fascinating places. It feels like we're always still learning. I mean, in the news today, we just found out that fish can apparently recognize individual humans. So it's this constant set of discovery that's happening. And that's the same for the bioacoustic space, learning about sound and how sound is important. And that really tethers to our first WOPAM objective, which is advancing that bioacoustic research. And some of what we want to do is the more sounds we understand, the more that we can relate that down to specific species, the more we have this real context of what we're listening to. And this really helps us improve our understanding not only for the species, but the environments that they occupy. And this means that we can also contribute these different sounds to some of the libraries like FishSounds, as well as the Global Library for Biological Sounds in general. And this means that that then can become accessible and a learning space for other people who want to sort of take that understanding and move that forward. And so one thing that's important to highlight, I think, is that when we're looking at these different sounds, if we take it into a reef context, you can still infer a lot of really meaningful information, even if you don't know exactly what's producing the sound. So here you can see, for example, without the species IDs, if you have a recording, you can still start to get an understanding of, for example, okay, at these times of day, we're hearing a lot of human-made noise. So you get an idea of this might be happening at particular times, and maybe we need to work towards being aware of that in our mitigation of some of those impacts. But once you start to get to the species ID, you're able to see, okay, which species are present or absent. Perhaps some of the species present are actually invasive species that weren't there before or actually causing some ecological challenges. And so that can be really informative. Or there are key behaviors there that you know, if you're able to track that through sound, you're really able to monitor some of these important behaviors within some of the populations. And so these are some of the ways in which once you're uncovering some of these unknowns, you can actually really have informative impact with what you're learning. And so what I thought we could do is have an opportunity to listen in to some of these sounds. So you might be listening just to the reef itself. Let me know if you can hear this. Or you might have that you're listening in to an unborn damselfish, or an orange-fin clownfish, or perhaps, if it's swimming close enough to the reef, maybe a humpback whale. And a quick shout out to Ben Gottesman, who shared this recording of a humpback whale with me. And one thing that's really important for us to highlight, just going to check in the chat that you can hear. Sorry. Oh, great. I'm glad that came through. Perfect. So one thing that's important to highlight is that, well, humpback whale wants to speak again, is that sometimes when we're talking about uncovering unknowns, it's important to remember that this might also be recognizing knowledge. So when we talk about unknowns, we're talking about what is described in the academic literature and published. But there is so much traditional ecological knowledge that relates to this. There are many spearfisher communities, for example, who could go right in and say, oh, I know this, and this is from these different sounds, and that they can actually tell you that. And so it's really important for us to actually state that recognizing and respecting this mutual knowledge exchange is absolutely key if we want to advance these things in collaborations, but also more broadly. And so that there is real incredible knowledge out there that isn't necessarily just described in the academic literature, and we really need to highlight that in any collaborative effort. And so one of the things that WOPAM did was we were thinking about, okay, if we're trying to work towards learning more about what we're hearing, we thought, let's set up a workshop. And so we had just under 100 people from 30 different countries and 55 different institutions all come together to really try and understand, okay, what are some of these key questions that we might want to focus on? Because within the collaborative community, you want to have space where everyone is participating in how you move it forward. And so what we found was there were these key themes of what people were most interested in exploring. Some of it was getting an idea of, on World Oceans Day, how much man-made noise or human-made noise are we hearing around on that global perspective? How much are we influencing these acoustic environments? And equally, which species are we hearing and where can we find them? For example, can we see all the places that we heard dolphins on a global scale on this one day? And equally being able to better understand where there's so many incredible advances that are moving forward with machine learning and artificial intelligence, how can we start to use some of those incredible new tools to really help advance the process of uncovering some of what we don't yet know, or at least don't have formally described in our collaborative space? And one thing to highlight, obviously, with a World Oceans collaborative effort, you've got different pieces of equipment, people are recording in different weather or at different depths. So we really wanted to have an opportunity to sit and talk about how do we standardize some of what we're looking at and to tease apart the story that we can see from very variable data, as well as thinking about who wants to drive forward some of this analysis and make this a real collaborative effort so that the community can start answering some of these questions. And then also thinking about what do we want to do for WOPAM 2025 and 2026, and how do we move forward not only in the scientific objective advancing bioacoustic research, but also in our other objectives as well. And so an example that I just wanted to give real quickly in terms of what this community has been working on for this objective is we've been partnering with a group called Acoustics to try and see whether there's a way of building a fish finder. And so what this might be is a way where you can detect, cluster, and categorize some of these different sounds that you're finding in the recordings and see whether this can be done with the aid of machine learning so that it can just be much faster. And we might not be able to always know how to attribute that to a specific species yet, but at least we'll have these categories that we can work with, and that can make it really useful. And we've been talking with FishSounds partners about how can we use this as a tool so that once we get to the point where we know which species are making which sounds, you've got these categories of sounds that can help and feed into these libraries. And this is really important for you have WOPAM collaborators that are participating in that. And Dr. Ashley Lillis, who gave a talk through the FishSounds Seminar Series as well, so I encourage you to listen to that if you get a chance. She's been part of the group of WOPAM collaborators that are thinking, how can we share our data to really help advance this? Now, a lot of her recordings come from the coasts of Mozambique as well as the coast of Zanzibar. And that is really important because these are areas that aren't always necessarily represented in the same way on those global collaborative acoustic efforts. And so we want to make sure that if anything is being built that can detect and cluster and categorize sounds, make sure that it's robust and it's working well across global regions that maybe aren't always as well represented. And so another element of what WOPAM is trying to do is trying to make bioacoustics more accessible. And so this really feeds into when we're exploring what does it actually mean to be listening to these ocean voices and how do we connect to what we're hearing. And so this ties in directly to that second objective we have of engaging and celebrating with what we're hearing and really making this a space where anyone can participate. And so to do that, we've been thinking, well, a really important part is actually showcasing the WOPAM recordings and the sounds of interest and the different visualizations and representing this collaborative effort and what they're doing. And so wanting to build an interactive map where you not only have access to the scientific information, but you can also start to see this creative engagement that's coming from around the world. And we have a really brilliant partner called Jack Hines, who's helping us work on that. So not only is he an ArcGIS whiz, so he's really good at visualizing data and providing this visual data of this recording effort, he's also in of himself a artist and a soundscape recorder and a soundscape creative. So if you get the chance, listen to Ears to the Wild. It's also brilliant to have someone who's working along the team who, is connecting across these different levels, looking at how we can share the information from the data and looking at how we can connect with this creatively. And so what we'd like to do, and this is just a quick example as a proof of concept, is when you look up at all those data points on the map, that when you hover over a particular recording, you get to see, oh, okay, Ashley Lillis just took this recording, and this is some of the sounds that she heard. Snapping shrimp were in her recording. Why is that something that's interesting? What does that mean? What kind of research is she doing? And so enabling this way to really promote and showcase the different people that are involved and why these sounds are so relevant to the work that they're doing. And also being able to just see that this was really a quote I really appreciated in a Nature editorial, where they said that artists and scientists alike are immersed in discovery and invention, challenge and critique. And so what we want is we really want to interlink the entire community on this platform and this interactive map and showcase all of the different ways that these different multidisciplinary skill sets are coming together within this collaborative community. And so to do this, we really want to engage with creatives such as musicians and visual artists to see how we can connect to the sounds that we're hearing. And we're going to have a workshop for that purpose as well, in which different musicians, visual artists or creatives can come and see what would be a way they think would be impactful to listen into these sounds, or how do these sounds inspire them, and see what we can do in terms of presenting these different creative outputs. And that's a different way of learning and participating in what we're doing and what we're discovering. So it's that shared process of the discovery and understanding, as well as that participation and motivation. And so that you not only connect in and hear the snapping shrimp from that particular recording, perhaps you start to see a spectrogram overlay of the different sounds that form part of that soundscape. And one of the things that was done with Alejandro Bernal for last year's WOPAM effort was a lot of fun, where he is a fantastic Colombian music producer and composer. And he took these different sounds from the WOPAM effort in 2023, and just using these sounds from underwater creatures, he created an original song. Now you can find this on our website, but you can also find it, it's called Primero Estaba el Mar. In the beginning was the sea, and you can find it on SoundCloud and YouTube. But I'll share a little mini sample. It's obviously too long for the whole talk, but here's a little sample for you and a QR code if you're curious. So I think it's awesome. I know I'm biased, but if you're curious to hear the whole thing, then you can also ask me, and I'm happy to share it for you. So this is really something that we're excited to think about also in terms of WOPAM 2025. And that's because WOPAM 2025, which is this coordinated effort on World Oceans Day, will be just at the same time as the United Nations Ocean Conference this year, which is happening in France. And so we're trying to think about how can we align this moment of collaborative listening to this moment where big leaders are coming together to discuss how we can move forward the Sustainable Development Goals for that are focused in on the ocean. And so we're really keen to think about how can we have our presence, because we'll be at the UN Ocean Conference, think about how we can creatively engage in this space to showcase not only the power of sound, but how it's important and impactful for some of these Sustainable Development Goals. And so when we think about the Sustainable Development Goals that relate directly to the ocean, some of the main targets that they will be thinking about is how do you protect and restore ecosystems? What are ways in which we can have more sustainable fishing, and how do we conserve coastal and marine areas? Now, these are all targets that will be sort of core to the discussions at this meeting. And how can we explore? We know that bioacoustics can be informative and helpful for each of these different targets. So how can we encourage and express that in really diverse, creative ways? And so this is something where we're thinking a lot about the creative action that can take place, but really how does it lead to that positive impact? And that's sort of an open blank canvas that we're working towards. And another thing that we're doing is that we're working with Acoustics and the Deep, which is a fantastic aquarium based in the UK. And so here what we'll be doing is creatively thinking about how we can connect with a different audience than those who are, or likely a different audience than those who are attending the UN conference, which is a lot of policymakers and sort of leaders, country leaders. We'll be talking with families and children and really exploring these interactive displays as well as acoustic immersion. So what does it mean to listen into this space, and fish make sound, and what are the importance of those sounds that they might be hearing? And really try to showcase that the bioacoustics is so important for these ocean environments and to build that greater understanding. But equally important is also to really encourage any of the youth that are participating in this to feel like they are actively a part of this community. And that means that when they engage, that they are not only learning, but they are part of that participatory force and that movement towards that shared goal. And so we're thinking of having a collective message that any students or participants at the Deep can share and contribute to the UN Ocean Conference so that they can feel part of that movement as that next generation of ocean voices. And this is something that I think is quite exciting because the UN Ocean Conference has spoken about making all ocean voices heard. And so I think this is really poignant, not only for the wildlife that are the sound producers under the sea, but also those new generations of voices who are listening and who would really hope to be heard in and joining their voice to it. And so when we're thinking about that, the final WOPAM element that we're really thinking carefully about is incorporating bioacoustics more readily into ongoing conservation strategy. And so this is something that is really important about identifying partnerships for that knowledge exchange so that you can do that as effectively as possible. And that is tethered to our third objective of how can WOPAM be useful for that? Because one thing that I totally acknowledge, and I'll be the first to say, is a coordinated effort listening for a day or perhaps a few days isn't instantly going to provide conservation solutions all around the world. So how can we make that effort part of the sort of conservation action that we see on the ground with these project-specific goals where people are doing really fantastic work? And so one of the ways we can really understand how bioacoustics is important as a conservation indicator is actually that, for example, if you're looking at, if you're listening into a recording and you learn, okay, there's this species that's present, or they're doing this really important behavior, you're starting to get an understanding of where your recording is taking place, and that can actually lead to getting a stronger understanding of the indicators of the ecosystem's condition. Is it doing better over time? Perhaps it's doing worse, and this can be a way you can monitor that space. Equally, if you're able to record the human activity that you find in the area or across different habitats, you might be able to get an indicator for the threats that this area might be experiencing. Or perhaps in certain fragile ecosystems, you might be able to document and record and learn more about how those threats are impacting the fragility of that ecosystem and their chance of reaching tipping points. And finally, if you're recording sounds over time or over differing environmental contexts, then you're actually being able to build up an indicator of the effectiveness of the strategies that you're implementing. For example, if you record over a marine protected area versus areas that aren't protected, what key differences are you finding, and are the strategies that you've implemented really working over time? And that's really informative for conservation action. So the ways in which WOPAM can tether to conservation action is that we have this collaborative network, and so that's a space where there can be shared knowledge and exchange. Perhaps someone is working on a particular species and they found a really good way of using bioacoustics to answer some of those key questions, and they can help support where there are other places where people are working on a similar species. Or also just providing this opportunity for people to see how bioacoustics could be a useful tool for their project-specific challenges. So in some ways, WOPAM can be this bridging force between bioacoustics and conservation. But that really needs to be tethered in that exchange across that collaborative community, and is fundamentally based on the conservation expertise that people who are deeply working in those local communities and local areas, they'll have those expertise. And so for WOPAM to be more useful for conservation efforts, an example of some of what we're doing in some of our partnerships is we've developed a partnership where we're setting up a passive acoustic monitoring pilot. And this was through partners at the Yang Center for Conservation Bioacoustics, where WOPAM is housed. We were working with the Malamba Coastal Collaborative. They're an absolutely fantastic group that are working off the coast of Mozambique. And they work there and are in partnership with the Fisher Council in the area. And so the Fisher Council are the local communities that manage the area and manage the coastal environment. And what they have been noticing is, and identifying as threats, there are drastic changes in the fish stocks, as well as real changes to the climate and a sort of destabilization of the cycle of the climate that they've been experiencing, as well as real development risks in areas that are not very well monitored in terms of baseline data. So they're concerned about what do these changes mean if there's a chance for development. And so the real identified need that came from the conservation partners was wanting to establish baselines, assess the reef condition, and monitor some of those changes that might be happening. And bioacoustics can be really effective for this. So this is an exciting example of how WOPAM can be this connector and bridge across the conservation partner and the bioacoustics tool. And so one of the things, just to reiterate, is if you have your research output and you want to bring it to conservation impact, then that is absolutely tethered into a cornerstone of the conservation need. And this is quite complex sometimes at times to understand, okay, what's this particular situation need? What are the challenges, and how can we develop threat abatement strategies that are likely to work over time? And for that, you really need to foster those partnerships and learn and exchange together to actually be able to target those threats and develop those strategies that might be effective. And so WOPAM is working on that, but we are relatively new. We started in 2023. And so what I wanted to showcase with you is also not only projects and partnerships that we're developing and working towards, but also actual projects and efforts that have done the monitoring, done the bioacoustics work, and actually started to show some of the outputs of that, so that you can see the research output linking directly to conservation impact. And so when you break that down as to how do you use bioacoustics for conservation, or how might you sort of break that into different stages, this is a really nice infographic that I think is really helpful for visualizing that. So if you start with your strong partnerships that you've identified that need and you want to work together to answer that, that's going to come from different people who are involved in that conversation. And so you identify the need that you want to strive to try and improve. That might be taking a species focus, or perhaps it's a habitat focus. So you might be looking at an endangered species that you really want to try and ensure that their populations are not going to be in decline. Or you know that there's, for example, a coral reef environment that you want to work to try and conserve and to better understand. Now, what you might do is you might take a series of acoustic measurements. That could be looking at the different types of calls that you're hearing, or maybe just the diversity of different calls, or the different levels of human-made noise that you might be detecting in the area. And from that, you can start to make different acoustic inferences. So you get an idea of some of the behaviors that are present in the area, or even start to understand more about the biodiversity across these diverse habitats. And so from this, you get to sort of build into the scientific output, and that is that evidence base of what you're learning. So bioacoustics is an effective tool to get there. And then once you have that scientific output, you can put in the work to try and integrate that into that project-specific area to develop those conservation outcomes. And I highlight that arrow just because it's not a simple jump. Once you know what your scientific output is or what your evidence base is, it doesn't mean that it automatically gets adopted into conservation practice and that it automatically works. These spaces are complex, and it takes time to really ensure that that is done properly if you want that to last in the long term. But some of the ways that bioacoustics can be useful towards that effort is that it can be scalable and it's tractable, in the sense that you can record, maybe you've recorded in one marine protected area and then you want to record over a few more, so you can have that spatial scale that can grow, as well as having the temporal scale. If you're trying to monitor an area and you can record for months and months, that can be really informative. And so you can start to look across different species that you're interested in, or you can start to look at changes over time. What are some of the patterns that you're seeing, as well as comparing across different habitats that you know are really important for a local area or for a local community. And so what I wanted to do now is just to showcase a couple of examples of where bioacoustics has been incorporated in some of the monitoring, and where I think it's got some really cool examples of conservation impact as well. And so this is how that bioacoustics can be applied. And so for a species-specific example, you might just want to know about this one species. And so in this example, I'm going to talk about Marisol's work, who is a PhD student here at the Cornell Center for Conservation Bioacoustics. And she works within these seasonally flooded forests in the Brazilian Amazon. So this is a freshwater example, but all the same. And so what she's looking at is exploring freshwater soundscapes and trying to get a feeling for how sound can be informative for the species community structures that you might see in the area, and these dynamics that might become apparent. And so one of the species that she focuses on is, and forgive me if I mispronounce this, but I think it is locally known as the pirarucu or pirarucu, which is an Arampaima species, and they are really vulnerable, but also data deficient. So we just don't know a whole lot about this species. What we do know is that they are really culturally important, not only to support the local community fisheries, but also there's a lot of knowledge that's tethered in around this species. And one of the things that I think is pretty cool about this species of fish is they're called obligate air breathers. So what they have to do is they actually have to jump out of the water, take a gulp of air, and then land back in the water, and that sounds like this. And so what Marisol has been doing in partnership with these local communities is that they have been combining the traditional visual monitoring that the local communities have been doing to see when they come out and gulp their air and dive back down, with this real acoustic signature that can be detected, to start to get a feel for the numbers that they're finding and to try and get a better idea of how the population is doing in general. And so this has shown this real partnership and knowledge exchange, and how the tool of bioacoustics can be really beneficial to starting to get a stronger notion of how this population is doing in these areas. Another example might be not so much to do with whether the species is there or not, but actually wanting to get at some of these key behaviors that we see. And there are a lot of really important interactions across these different underwater creatures, no matter which habitat we look at. But one specific example is that there are at least 100 different types of coral reef fish from 20 different families that form what we call spawning aggregations. And these are really important. They sort of all gather up together to reproduce at the same time. And this is something that a lot of grouper species do. So this is an example of a grouper species. And groupers are not only really important for a lot of local fishery communities because they are a highly valued and needed fish species for groups that fish, but they're also really important within the ecosystems that they occupy. And this study, just for example, showed that when the predators were absent, there was a huge drop in the diversity of fish that you find in those areas. And so it just highlights how the presence of these species is really important for the overall function of these reefs. And so what we were thinking about is they looked at the particular Nassau grouper, which is really critically endangered, and their populations have really dropped to drastically low numbers. And so monitoring that population is really important. And so perhaps looking at bioacoustics as a tool to look at these spawning aggregations of some of these grouper species could be a really useful way to have conservation impact. And so unfortunately I don't have the sound of this, but this is an example of Nassau groupers all coming together in a mass spawning event. So excuse the little jumpiness of it, but what they do is they all rush together, the female releases her eggs, and the males all rush to try and release the sperm at the same time so they get an opportunity to fertilize as many eggs as possible. And Wildlife Conservation Society in Belize have actually set up a spawning aggregation monitoring setup for these Nassau groupers. And so what they're doing is they're using passive acoustic monitoring, where they're working with both the intentional sounds that are produced as well as the incidental noises that are coming from these interactions in the Nassau grouper when they create these, when they have these spawning aggregations, as well as monitoring this this sort of key stage in population life history. You've got so many numbers coming together that being able to monitor at this time is really important. And being able to monitor this acoustically is quite effective. And so what that means is they're getting this acoustic data that helps really inform how do they manage their protected area? When are the spawning aggregations happening? When do you find that the spawning aggregations are within the marine protected area versus outside? And that can really be informative of how you might move forward some of your conservation efforts for a population that really needs to be monitored. And another example is actually not a species, it's more focused on the human impacts of a particular area. And so this is blast fishing or dynamite fishing. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but basically what this is you throw often a handmade explosive into the water, and the blast causes fish to be stunned or killed, and so you can collect them quite quickly and quite easily in the space. Now, this is an illegal practice virtually everywhere, but it's quite hard to regulate that and also really hard to report it. And so trying to get a stronger idea of when it's happening and where can be really challenging, especially because people sometimes feel really uncomfortable about sharing information about blast fishing. And so WWF had worked together with this collection, had worked to set up a sort of pilot study to try and better understand when was blast fishing happening and how might we be able to get a stronger understanding of it. And so what they thought of doing was looking at how passive acoustic monitoring could be a way of getting at the fact that they just didn't have enough data of where these blast fishing events were happening as well as where that they might be occurring. And so what they did is they took out 2 acoustic recorders and they went and they recorded sort of a 2-day recording just to try and characterize what a blast might sound like underwater, as well as recording sort of for a month long across the Dar es Salaam coast to try and get a feeling of, okay, how often are we hearing these different blast events? And one recorder disappeared, which is just an example of how any research that you do in any of these environments, and definitely within the ocean, things go wrong, equipment gets lost, and it's just to showcase that that happens to absolutely everyone. But what they did still have was 45 recordings. And from that, they could build this network where they could sort of semi-automatically detect blast fishing events that was pretty accurate, actually. And so what this meant was they were starting to build these first steps of being able to potentially monitor this activity across the Tanzanian coast. And so this is just a way of connecting in how that bioacoustic monitoring can be a really useful way to gain that understanding of a human impact to a habitat and how we can try and see and implement that evidence base into some of that conservation strategy moving forward. And so I think to sort of take a step back across the WOPAM's different objectives and thinking about how we strive towards those collaborative shared goals, it's really also when you think about a global bioacoustic collaboration, what that is it's the collaboration that's building what it can be, essentially. And so if you've got musicians, aquariums, educators, ecologists, producers, performers, conservation practitioners, such as we find within the WOPAM project, then it really is, as long as you have your shared goals of what you're trying to strive towards, and you're planning carefully for how you're going to have measurable impact and how you're going to check that is that really working, as well as then having these careful laid plans for how you have effective communication, then a collaboration is truly what you want it to be, right? And I think that that is really hopeful and inspiring in times where it can be quite hard to think of what some of these positive solutions can be to quite complicated issues. But when you have this collaborative effort, then some of that can feel really galvanizing in terms of some of the solutions that we're exploring. And I just want to leave you with this. I think it's a wonderful quote by Rachel Carson, who is a famous author for those of you who are perhaps not as familiar, and really was a strong voice in some of the environmental movements in the world. And she wrote, "Those who contemplate the beauty of the earth find reserves of strength that will endure as long as life lasts. There is something infinitely healing in the repeated refrains of nature." And that last bit, I think, is really particularly strong for bioacoustics. Here in this bioacoustics collaboration, we're listening to the repeated refrains of nature. And so I think that that is really something that is quite powerful and an exciting space to be in and to see what will come of it. So I just want to say thank you for listening to me. And if any of you are curious or want to consider being involved, I really hope you know and feel that anyone with any of their expertise is really welcome to enrich the space. If you have any questions and you want to speak to me directly, please feel welcome to email me. And I obviously want to open up the space for questions, but I just thought little discussion pointers that I can throw at you. What I would really love to know what you think is what might you think that leads to improved impact over time? What do you think is perhaps missing in the WOPAM effort? What could we do more of? And how is bioacoustics different? You know, how is a bioacoustic collaboration different from other collaborations? And what might be some of our strengths in that? So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Isla, for that amazing presentation. You really convey your enthusiasm for the subject and the work that you're doing. And it certainly makes me think even more about the value of all these collaborative efforts that I'm grateful to be a part of as well. So thank you so much for that. But yeah, we do have a few times for questions or comments related to Isla's discussion questions at the end there. So I can open it up.
Can I ask one right away? I know that's kind of selfish. But yeah, that was an incredible talk. And sorry, I had my camera off. I'm at my folks' house. So my parents kept popping by, drinking their morning coffee and watching your talks, which is neat because I think they kind of don't understand what I do. And now you did a better job explaining it than I do. So yeah, I was thinking about this recently, like in terms of the upcoming COP meetings, conservation meetings, the global temperature going above that 1.5 for the last year. And I was kind of thinking about that yesterday as I was driving home with the parallels to kind of like the change in ocean soundscapes and how the science has been very rigorous about quantifying that change in temperature. So we think about it in terms of when will the decade reach this? When will the year reach this? How many different measurements across the globe do we need to say this safely? And I think that's a really neat approach because it makes that data very trustworthy. And so I was thinking as you were talking, if there's, and I know bandwidth is always an issue, but you have so many great folks working globally. Do you think within the 1 day monitoring, there'd be the way to like anchor some sites in specific locations that are also recording continuously or more or less continuously, like throughout the year? So you have this kind of like, these are our long-term stations. This is our day effort. If run that through time, then you really get this neat picture of like, here's how things changed seasonally, and then here's how that kind of maybe is mirrored or not mirrored within the day. Is there any kind of, and I know it's, you're already taking on so much, so the answer can be like, hey, when we have time kind of thing, but is there any thought about expanding out to be that kind of two temporal scales?
I think it's a really interesting idea. Just to double check that I'm aligned in your thinking. So you mean that, for example, when someone's engaging in this sort of longer term trajectory of what these areas are experiencing, that they then also have the WAPAM recording as a kind of highlighter of the representation over the years on that day. This is what we're finding is different. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, and also just kind of pulling within. So like the Smithsonian does this. They'll have here's our biodiversity monitoring locations that are fixed, and here's our bigger push years or weeks or months. And so this would be like, here's 10 locations that have been chosen or, are just possible logistically that are recording within this data set, like we're going to go into this kind of data set that are recording throughout the year. And then here's our big push, 120, 100. I mean, that number is going to keep growing. So 150 people on this one day. And then you would have this like, here's how the ocean has gotten louder. You'd have these really great ocean noise change estimates and these kind of things, but then also have this global effort. So yeah, something like that, putting in a fixed station and saying, we'll take what we can get on this one day, but we also have these efforts that we're pulling together, less data in terms of space, but more data in terms of time.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's not something we're doing now, but I definitely agree that it would be super cool to look into. I think also that as WPAM grows in the sense that as we have this recording effort every year over with, like as you said, a short temporal scale but large spatial scale every year, I think that will be really interesting to look at, especially when we're then talking about some of these larger, longer term global patterns, and then still have that connection with, like you said, that longer temporal scale where you can really see, okay, this isn't just a blip, this is actually something that we're consistently seeing. And so you get that global perspective from this collaborative effort mirrored into the sort of robust local scale context with the data. I think,
Yeah.
yeah, it's not something that I'm doing right now, but definitely I think it's a really important part of the message. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. Very cool. Yeah. And again, incredible talk.
Thank you.
You didn't quite mention it enough, but I did send in the chat the WOPAM website for people who are
Oh,
interested.
great.
And yeah, what if people want to get involved in WOPAM, what are sort of like what should people do if they're interested?
Yeah, so I think totally depends also on how they want to be involved, because as through the talk we've talked about the different objectives that we have. But I think the easiest way is just reach out, and we can have a conversation. I'm really open to that. I think that's there's so many, some of the really amazing creative ideas or ways in which people have thought about what we can do. They're not, I might be talking about them, but they're not my ideas, right? They're coming from that collaboration and the community. So I'd say if you want to be involved or you think of things that could be quite a a powerful contribution or you think might be just fun to do as well, then just reach out and we can explore whether it's possible. And in any case, have you part of the community is always great.
Amazing. Thank you. Yeah, I see a hand raised. Oh, you're muted still.
Yes. Hi, I'm Marie-F. Clark. I was wondering, first, very interesting presentation. Thank you very much. I love all the project that you've shown and the example in collaboration. And I was wondering, I think some of those would be great to showcase like to young people or the public in general. And I was wondering if WOPAM has or is thinking of maybe producing like a resource kit for science communication to the public or at primary school or high school level. Yeah, is that a thing or?
It's not a thing yet, but I think that would be really great because some of the engagement that we've been having with sort of 4 to 14-year-olds, which I know is a really broad age range, has been honestly some of the best questions I've ever been asked have come from that community. Where one 4-year-old asked me questions about how sound might be relevant for coral reefs, and just a few weeks later, cutting edge science came out to show that corals, literally little coral polyps, are using sound to settle on the reef. And so I think that it's really important to have that exchange and for not only to set up that capacity to talk to children, but also have a bit of structure, like you're saying, in terms of how you might engage. We don't have anything for that just yet. We're actually working, with the aquariums to try and set up that interactive educational display. I know that FishSounds does a lot of brilliant work in relation to this, so they might have a good answer for that. But it's definitely something we want to do. It's just making sure that it's crafted as that tailors into each different school's structure, and on a global scale that's quite different, but definitely just start somewhere and then grow from that, I think would be really interesting.
Okay. Thank you.
Just
And thank you, Audrey, for posting.
yeah.
And I'm going to take a
Yeah,
look at
not to
that.
do a soft plug in your talk, Isla, but FishSounds Educate does offer a resource hub based on our education and outreach project, including workshop templates with PowerPoints, as well as other links. And so, yeah, we're excited to see WOPAM grow, but in the meantime, we have some of those resources as well.
And we should be shouting it out to the roofs because you're part of the collaborative community, right? So there is that's happening. So it's great to celebrate that for sure.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you for your question. I know we're at the hour, but there was another question in the chat. So if you don't mind going just a little bit longer, and if folks need to hop off, no worries, of course. But the question in the chat was, what is your impression of the movement for decoding interspecies communication using AI ML as a tool to get buy-in with bioacoustics? Should we listen or record just for the sake of biodiversity, or does it make sense to add on this other dimension? Thank you for your talk.
That's a good question. So I think that it's also quite a big one because there's so many different ways in which we could, what are we listening to and what are we decoding as well? We'll take there'll be different chapters to that. I think that the sort of energy and excitement around being able to translate what these different species are communicating with each other, it's cool. I think it's quite interesting. I think we need to be, or at least I find myself thinking about how we do want to be careful about presuming that what the machine learning might show in one case, that's always going to be replicated. Of course, there's a lot of individual variation, for example, in different whales talking to each other. There's also a lot of perhaps harder to measure bonds between different individuals in these interactions. And so I think it's an exciting space and it's definitely worth exploring. But maybe that we also are mindful of the fact that because something is like a pattern and maybe we're learning like, oh, they're calling to each other, doesn't always necessarily mean that that's all that's being said or that that's always going to be what that signal might mean. And so I think it's important to recognize that we're only just getting into our capacity to translate some of this. And that's great, but it doesn't mean that we are fluent in what we're listening to or that we're going to be fluent across all the different species and their interactions, because it's a complex space and that's partly what makes it so exciting. So I think it's great in terms of a way of showcasing not only what machine learning is being able to expand, but also just showing and highlighting how we're only getting started in translating some of these ocean voices.
Amazing. And we do have a raised hand, so maybe this will be our last question, if you don't mind. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the presentation. I was wondering if you have already used some device or tool that can record in real time the marine sounds, so you can, for example, take action immediately if there is any sound of maybe dynamite. Yeah, that was my question. Thank you.
Great. It's a great question, and it's not something that we've been working on directly, or at least that I've been working on, because it takes quite a little bit more of infrastructure to actually have something be able to communicate. Because if you think about it, often what happens is we deploy the recorder, and we just let it sort of almost be non-existent in the environment, that we don't want it to influence the environment, so it just sits there and record, and later we go and collect it and we're able to gather the information, but that can be months later. So you're right that it doesn't have that immediate informative capacity. There are people and teams working on seeing how they can maybe have the capacity to record, then have a detector that instantly detects the relevant part of the sound and goes, bing, this is what you were looking for, and that information then gets translated to a place where people can be notified about that detection, and then it can be told where. But that's a lot of different steps that need to be built into a sort of a loop and a system. And sometimes the places where we might want to monitor, that's a lot of infrastructure to incorporate and to set up. And so it's really about thinking also how you would maintain that and how you'll be able to build that infrastructure into these spaces. But it's definitely something that I know a lot of teams are talking about, because exactly like you say, it could be a really powerful tool to being able to better understand what's happening right there in the moment.
Right. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Amazing. And yeah, Brittany shared an example of Ocean Networks Canada that does real-time acoustic monitoring that you can look up on their
Cool.
website. But I don't think that they're at the point of doing like automatic detection notifications for certain sounds yet. But there are several other efforts. Like I know this is a big interest, but has all of those challenges that you mentioned for sure, Isla. So yes, exciting field with all of these different topics
It
to
is,
grow from for sure.
yeah, it's cool.
Yeah, amazing. Wonderful. So with that, let's thank Isla again for a wonderful presentation. I think it was a really great showcase of all of the value of collaborations, especially in the bioacoustic space. And we're really grateful for your insights and all of your work with WOPAM, especially. Such an exciting effort. So this is our second to last seminar. We only have one more left, and I will be presenting on fisheries applications of fish sounds, especially. And so you can register at the link I just sent in the chat. And if you liked the seminar and want to check out our other ones, there are recordings of them on our YouTube channel. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending and for, again, a wonderful seminar, Isla. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you to everyone for making the time, and thanks for making this possible, Audrey and Kieran.
Amazing. Thank you.
Great.